Hello, and welcome to M&A's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and I serve M&A as their Director of Ecosystems Development. Growing up in suburban Pennsylvania, I was surrounded by farms, many of which were Amish and Mennonite families. Still, my image of rural America was shaped by what I saw on TV. Green Acres and the Beverly Hillbillies. Well, they found humor in the culture clash between urban and rural America. There was, of course, the rural idyll of Mayberry, where Sheriff Taylor didn't need a gun because crime was a city problem. Today, those images of rural America are captured in reality shows like Axemen, Swamp People, Mountain Men, Moonshiners, Duck Dynasty. Well, most, of course, have run their course, but the image lingers on. You know, there is no set definition of what is meant by rural when it comes to our government. See, government defines what is urban, and whatever does not fit that classification is therefore rural. In other words, there is no set demographic definition for what rural means. When it comes to landmass, that encompasses about 95% of the United States. Population-wise, about 22% of Americans live in areas that are not urban, therefore rural. The image that is unfortunately held by most Americans is that rural is synonymous with farmers or poor whites. The fact is, there is a great diversity in rural America. In the West and Southwest, we of course neglect to consider the indigenous peoples. The fastest growing population of rural America across the states, especially in the West and Southwest, are Hispanics. And only 6% of folks living in rural America are employed in agriculture. Most are in education, healthcare, retail, construction. And another false assumption is that rural America is churched, that the need of the gospel is for urban areas, not the less populated regions. Well, today we're going to talk with those who are reaching small town America. Those places often neglected by church planters who imagine that the city is where the gospel is needed most. Our panel is comprised of practitioners and pundits who have a heart for rural America. With us today is Alan Foster. Alan is the M&A Church Planter Recruiting Director, and he runs a cohort of pastors who labor in rural contexts. Corey Pelton was recently called by the Tennessee Valley Presbytery as an evangelist to start rural church development in southern Appalachia. That's extreme North Georgia, southeastern Tennessee, with a goal of developing, encouraging, and resourcing church plants. Hutch Garmany is a pastor in that region at Grace Community in Trenton, Georgia, a rural southern Appalachian town in northwest Georgia, area of about 5,000 people living there. Hutch is also the chair of the Tennessee Valley Church M&A Committee. Tim Inman is the pastor of Christ Church in Dunn, North Carolina. He and his family moved back to Tim's hometown in spring of 2019 to scratch plant. And then finally, we have Kent Suits in his fourth year of planting Christ Community Church in Batesburg, Leesville, South Carolina. He started a plant with 7 members of an independent Methodist congregation who gave their church property to the PCA to start a new church in this historic, diverse, rural southern town. Well, before we jump in, just want to always remind you, this is meant to be a conversation, not just among the panelists here, but with you who are attending. So in the chat box below, please send any questions you may have. There's also the Q&A box as well. Well, as we get underway, Corey, let's just start with you. You've just started a new work. You're coming from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but heading back more to the southeast to begin this work. Tell us about that work, and with that, some of the aspects you learned even as you relocated into this area.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me on here. We literally have been here for a month and aren't in our house yet. Moved from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Blue Ridge, Georgia, from BR to BR, with the idea being called by Tennessee Valley Presbytery, of which Hutch is the M&A chair, and they called me to head up rural church development, which is sort of a 21st century circuit riding idea. Been thinking about this for about 20 years, and within this past year, started having conversations with Alan and Hutch and others about what it might look like to develop communities, several different communities at one time for future church planting. As a church pastor, I've planted churches. I've pastored a medium-sized PCA church. I've worked as an assistant pastor, and I love getting involved in communities. But as a pastor of a church, I felt somewhat handcuffed by the managerial aspect of pastoral ministry, and really loved being able to develop. And so the idea of this is to move into a hub town, which is Blue Ridge, Georgia, and to develop a circuit of other communities, go to those communities, build relationships, listen to what people are saying, go to the churches, listen to what people are hearing, begin to develop Bible studies in each community, look for local leadership in each of those communities, and also look for leadership outside, potential guys who may be in seminary and want to work in a rural context. And either of those come to pastor in each of those communities. And one of the byproducts of that is something, Chris, that you know well, is the whole cohort aspect, is that instead of sending these guys off into the middle of nowhere to be by themselves, we're actually getting several guys in nearby communities to pastor churches, and they've got the accountability and encouragement of each other. So that's the plan. I've been here a month. I've actually learned, I feel like I've learned a lot in a month, and I've got so much to learn. I really look forward to digging in further.
That's great. Thank you. And Alan, your role with M&A in being the church planter resource director, but you've had a role with a lot of rural planters, especially recently. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we're going to hear from the guys who have doing the planting in these different areas.
Yeah, probably about, 5 or 6 years ago, I had come into contact with a handful of guys who were either interested in planting in a small town, or were church planting leaders that wanted to see church plants take place in small towns. And I knew there wasn't much being written out there. There were no experts. Tim Keller had not written a book on planting in small towns, so nobody was reading anything about it. There was one book, Small Town Jesus, by, what's that guy's name? Anybody remember?
Donnie Griggs.
Donnie Griggs, there you go. He had written it, and I read it, and it was more motivational than it was instructional, which was fine. It was all about, we need to get out there and plant churches in small towns. But it didn't really do a lot to talk about the unique needs, the unique context, and this sort of thing. So I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, I gathered a bunch of us. I just had an interest in it, but also began to gather some guys together, and we met for a first retreat and had a great time just sharing ideas. And we've done it almost annually, COVID notwithstanding, ever since then. I think we had our 5th annual retreat, March of last year. And the idea was we gather together. There's no expert. It's not a seminar. It's not a how to do this. It was, we're learning from each other. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what's you found successful in your context. And we'll talk about everything from worship style to evangelism to the unique, doing ministry in the unique context of a small town. All of the guys I've been working with have been in small southern towns. I've not ventured to the Midwest or to the West or whatever. It's been guys that have been planting in small southern towns. In fact, I've even told some guys that want to come, your town is too big. You can't come. And I've told guys who were pastors in smaller towns, you can't come to our retreat because you're a pastor and not a planter. It's been specifically the unique needs of and issues surrounding planting in a small town. And it's been great. It's been great. think all the guys here on the panel so far have been. We've probably had another 8 or 10 guys to come. So
yeah, and you had said before we went on, if there are anyone who's listening who is a small town planter, to contact you, and we'll be sending out your email information after the webinar to contact you if they're interested in going. When is it? It's in
our
May?
next retreat is the first week of May. We try to aim it at the spring. I had some calendar conflicts myself this year, so we had to bump it until later. So it's the first week of May. It's a Tuesday evening through a Thursday at lunch. And yes, anybody that's interested, that wants to know more, would like to even attend, contact me. I'd love to tell you about it.
And it's in the in your neck of the woods, northeast Georgia, up in the
right. We used to meet on Lookout Mountain, but our location there isn't available any longer. So we met last year for the first time in northeast Georgia.
Okay, great. All right. Well, our three guys who are planting right now, I want to hear from you. Just kind of, again, it got a little brief introduction, but tell us a little bit about the context you're in, how you ended up there, what's been happening. Kent, you want to start off?
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure if we were going in introduction order or not. My name is Kent Suits. I started here in Batesburg, Leesville, 4 years ago. So moved into town as just my family and I, my wife, Caitlin, our 3 girls at the time. And as he said at the beginning, as Chris said, we actually started kind of in the in a flip way that most church plants start these days. So most church plants start with a core group of people from another church and no building. We started with a building and no people. So we were given a previous building of a previous independent Methodist church in town that had gotten down to 7 members, actually 8. One passed away right before I got here. I called them the Faithful 8 because they donated this entire property to us to start a new church. Very generous donation, building, education building, sanctuary, and a house. So we actually are still staying in the 4-bedroom house, the parsonage or manse. We've been here, and we started with an average attendance of 12, 7 plus my family of 5. We were there for a little while. And we have slowly grown. One of the ways I talk about rural church planting is it's like a good barbecue. It's low and slow. So we've been here. Our town is very diverse. There's actually a lot of historical racial division. One of the big motivators of the civil rights movement actually took place here in town. There was a book written about it a few years ago. There's a historical national monument put up for a guy named Isaac Woodard. We can talk about it more if you want to in a little bit, but there's a lot of racial diversity. And so part of our mission and vision is also trying to see if it's possible. All things are possible with God, but if he would want to bless an effort to become a racially diverse church in a small southern town, which really would be a testimony to his power and glory. So
that's great. Well, good. Well, Hutch, you've been in Trenton now for a fair number of years, and things seem to be going well there. Tell us about that. I mean, when I hear you're in Lookout Mountain, I always picture the north end of it, going, well, that's a pretty nice area. But you go down the ridge a bit, and it changes.
Yeah, it certainly does. So I'm in a small town called Trenton, Georgia, right in the corner of Georgia. Really nestled between Lookout Mountain and Sand Mountain, and not far, 20 minutes from Chattanooga. But the thing that really drew me to Trenton is that it is a small town, about 4,000 people in the town, but it's a town. It's not like a bedroom community. It's a town that very much has a strong sense of community. Most of the people that live there, they do life there too. They work there. The schools are the hub of the community. So a really deep sense of community there. Very Southern Appalachia. Unique thing about this town is it's called the state of Dade, is what they often refer to themselves as. And it's one of these what's been called an orphan county. There's a few of those in the United States, but they claim that they seceded from the Union before the state of Georgia and didn't rejoin until 1950. And so there's just this fierce independence that's, very Scots-Irish, not racially diverse at all, which is kind of gives you a sense that, even though we're talking about rural communities, you just heard Kent talk about being in a context that's very diverse. I'm the one that's 98% white. So we can talk about rural, but they can be pretty different based on where they are. And but I've really fallen in love with the community. I think oftentimes when people think about small towns, I think particularly as I think that we often think about this as ministers, is that we think about if we were to go to a small town and either plant or serve in a church, that it's kind of a forgotten place. It's a place that doesn't count, or you can't have impact. And I think one of the unique things about a rural community, because it's small, is that you can actually have a tremendous amount of impact over a shorter period of time. And I just think there's a lot of reasons and a lot of appeal to go and serve long-term in a small town. But we've been here 8 years. It's very rewarding. We particularized about 4 years ago. And so it's just been a great experience for us.
Case in point there, Hutch, last week, I met a guy in a store who was doing mission work in Israel, moved back in town. He connected me, set up a lunch last Friday with 5 pastors in town. Went to First Baptist. My wife and I went to First Baptist Church, where one of the pastors is pastoring on Sunday. They introduced my wife and I and said, I'm a PCA pastor here to start churches in the area at First Baptist Church. Talking about, just quick connects within small communities is fantastic, can be fantastic.
Yeah.
And Tim, you, as I mentioned, you went back home to Dunn. So tell us about that. What does that look like?
Yeah, I'm born and raised in Dunn. I didn't move for college. I went local. So I was straight all through Dunn and never left the area until I moved to Orlando for seminary. Dunn's a small city, about 45 minutes, 50 minutes from Raleigh, kind of nestled between Raleigh and Fort Bragg, Fayetteville area, if you know anything about Eastern North Carolina. We're far enough away to not be a bedroom community. We're not a suburb. About 10,000 people. Dunn culturally is an interesting place. It's very diverse. Like Ken's town sounds very similar. About 41% Black, 51% white, 8% Hispanic, with a long, tortured racial history. Historically, the Dunn is, this will give you a good window into what the different streams of culture that happen here. Dunn is the place where the Azusa Street Revival moved to the East Coast. And so Dunn was, I've got some guys outside my window. I'm on a call. Sorry. My office is on the downtown. Anyway, so Dunn is where Azusa Pentecostal explosion moved east. Some guys from Dunn went to LA, came back, started having services in a cotton gin. And that turned into the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. Basically, all the East Coast traditional Pentecostal churches sprung out from these revival meetings. So that's one stream. Second stream is Dunn is the birthplace and where the early years of the rock musician Link Ray, who is not a very well-known name, but he was a huge inspiration to Jimmy Page, all these early kind of rock guitarists. This was the guy that took a razor blade to his guitar speaker to make it fuzzy, and who's the first guy to play power chords. And so he's like father of rock guitar, Pentecostal moves east, and then or the favorite son of the town, General William C. Lee, who was the father of the 82nd Airborne. And so those streams of culture kind of all feed in to make Dunn a really unique place. It's very much Bible Belt in self-conception, but it's also a place where the majority of folks are missed. They live under steeples, but they're missed by the church entirely. I'm 3 generations deep in Dunn, and that kind of broadness describes my family as well. So that's where we are.
So already hearing some very distinct aspects, and you're all, again, we're talking from Dunn, North Carolina, Batesburg, Leesville, and Trenton, not too far. I mean, that's kind of in the center of the traditional PCA. And of course, rural America is much larger than that. But even in that swath, we're talking about some very diverse, to having almost no African-American presence, to being 50-50 in that context. So issue of diversity, you're diverse among yourselves.
Yeah.
It talks to us about what have been the challenges and some of the joys in that you've experienced in rural church planting that you would not necessarily find in an urban or suburban context.
I mean, I'll start with some joys. Joys are for me, and kind of a little bit surprising, is in a small town in the South, pastors are very highly respected still. So in some ways, I kind of joke about this sometimes. In some ways, a pastor of a known church in town is sort of like a little mini celebrity. So we're not celebrity pastors by any means throughout the United States and in our denomination, but in our small towns, if we're really getting in the community, people know who we are. So it's a positive because you're making an impact, but it also is it's a humbling reminder, like, people are really watching, and we are making an impact. So the town here, it wasn't my hometown. I grew up about 20 minutes away, but they were very welcoming of me moving into town when I would meet with people, share the mission and vision. And one unique, I would say, opportunity I've had in a small town is we have our own, kind of like what Hutch was saying, schools are very important here. And our school district is its own school district. So all the schools are just part of one district in town. And they have been very receptive to me being a pastor. And I've actually had an opportunity to serve as chaplain for the football team for the last 4 years. So I would say overall in the South, I don't know how it is everywhere, but in the South, in a small town, I've heard that the towns are still very receptive to pastors, and you can be a part of the chamber meetings, business meetings, all kind of places that I'm involved in. So
one thing I got to pick up on that you said that's just stuck out to me. You said you're not from there. They were very receptive. You grew up 20 minutes away.
Yeah.
That's just the other suburb, yes. That's nothing. But right. But again, I've heard this in other places. You're in a different context. So that tightness of that community, which again, when you can get in there and have an effect, you really, there's a web of relationships. Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
it's not like the
20 minutes away thing. My wife grew up and went to high school 30 minutes from Dunn, but she still has the conversation where it's like, oh, you're not from here. 30 minutes down the road, it's the next community over. We have families that drive from there to come to our church, but if you grew up in Dunn, that's that's 3 schools away. That's not here.
Yeah.
And if you really wanted to get into the nitty gritty, so Batesburg, Leesville, that is the one name of our town, but that historically was 2 different towns, Batesburg and Leesville. The way I say it is they got married in the 90s and hyphenated the name. But I mean, a lot of people still even say, oh, well, are you from the Batesburg side or the Leesville side? And so there's, even within the same town, there's definitely some of that. And the language of insider, outsider still gets thrown around every once in a while too.
Yeah, I've had to think through my response when people say, where are you from? And I'll say I was born in Georgia, raised in East Tennessee. I've been a lot of places in between, because there is a real sense. So this area, especially in Blue Ridge, Georgia, is a big tourist area. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are buying up the mountains, and so you've got the strange dynamic between transplants and people who are from here. A lot of people from Florida, a lot of people from Atlanta have moved in this, and it creates a very strange dynamic. And the guy who asked, well, a police officer actually asked me, where are you from? And I gave the right answer because he was a Tennessee fan, because he grew up in Copper Hill, Tennessee, which is the same city as McKaysville, Georgia.
Right.
It's the same place. So it's on the line. So it's, yeah.
Chris, I'd like to ask Hutch to just give a general description of what the characteristics are of a small town, what we've talked about in our retreats. How would you describe the uniqueness of a small town, rural town, Hutch?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, which you've heard some of the guys mention so far, is this deep love of place. In a small town, people are very proud of their community. There's a real attachment to history. They're almost, it could be considered tribal in some ways, because people's connection to their family is very, very strong. And oftentimes I've found that people's social network is like their extended family. So one of the challenges that presents is being able to break in, so to speak, being able to win trust. When people are not used to, like in a city, you might meet someone and they might be open to getting together for lunch the following week. Well, in a small town, it's just a lot slower. It takes time for people to begin to trust you. And as far as church planting goes, it takes time for someone to cross a barrier to come into and visit your church. Like, you might build a relationship with them, you might be building trust, you might be ministering to them, you might be sharing the gospel, you might be discipling them, but it might be a while before they're able to cross a barrier to actually come into your worship service. And sometimes that's because their family story has been connected to a particular denomination. My family's Baptist. Now, I might be totally unchurched. I might not believe. I might not have been in 25 years. But for me to come to your Presbyterian church is somehow a violation to my family identity. And so what I've found is that sometimes it takes someone in a family that's kind of willing to take a risk and step out, and they come and they start experiencing the gospel. But here's the neat part of that, is that when someone starts to get impacted by the gospel, all of a sudden you're going to see it begin to work through a family, through an extended family. Cousins are going to start coming, brothers and sisters are going to start, mom and dad are going to start coming. And then maybe some people they work on the shift with start to come. And so you have some of those dynamics that will work through a family. And I think that's pretty unique. So it can be slower on the front end. You have to have patience. You have to be in it for the long run. You're not going to show up and just have great marketing. And I think oftentimes in the PCA, we think, man, the way to build a church is to be a Tim Keller, an incredible preacher. And we always, I think, overestimate our preaching abilities. That's not going to work in a small town. People are not going to come because you're the next hottest thing, you market great, or you're an incredible speaker. They're going to come because you've loved them well. You've built a relationship with them. You've won trust. So it's different. You have to have a different mindset. It goes slower, but once it comes around, once the momentum begins to build, you can go a lot deeper, I think, because I've found that people are really willing to give themselves, to open their lives, to go all in. And they're not as transient that they might be as they might be in the city. So some of the positives and negatives there.
Oh, that's great. Well,
Can I add like two thoughts to that real quick? Because I've seen some of those same things. I sometimes talk to people about, if you go over to the Middle East and share the gospel with a Muslim and they believe, they have to really follow that verse that Jesus tells us, some have to leave their father and mother and brother and sister to follow after me. And I've talked to some people in town about, that's kind of the same way sometimes in these small towns, is some of these churches are, go back 4 or 5 generations, and it's a big deal for them to leave their family church. And some of these churches are just not preaching the Bible and preaching the gospel anymore. And I've said to one family in particular that has started coming to our church I said that very thing. Jesus said some people have to leave their father, mother, grandfather, grandmother to follow after me. So that is definitely true in the small town. The other thing is I've found, kind of going along with that, Hutch was talking about, we're not the greatest preachers, but people notice when you are preaching the Bible. That's probably true for all Bible believing churches when somebody comes from a background that's not doing that. But in our context, there's just very few really solid Bible believing, gospel preaching churches. So what I've seen is when people come in and see that done, it just hits them. It really hits people hard. So you don't have to be great, but I would say if you're a good Reformed preacher and you're sticking to the word, it's going to make an impact.
I think that's right, Ken. I've had a lot of people visit our church, and one of the immediate reactions is, I've never heard anyone teach or explain the Bible.
Yeah.
And so my obvious question is, well,
What do you got?
these are people who've been in church.
Yeah.
They've grown up around church at least. And I say, well, what happens? And typically it's a pastor gets up and it can be a dialogue, but he's going with whatever's happening or whatever he might notice in the congregation or what it's more of
he or she.
Sure. Well, we don't see much of that in our context.
Not us, but we got a lot.
But yeah, it's I think you're absolutely right, Kent, that there is a high value for the Bible still in these places, even if people don't ever read it. Yeah. Their world is enchanted, so to speak. They believe that there's something powerful associated with faith and Christianity and the Bible. And so when you take God's word seriously and you preach it faithfully, I do think that's very attractive in these small towns, and novel, very novel.
Yeah.
I would say this as well, that some of the same issues that go on in urban areas, same sinful struggles, are some of the same ones you'll find in rural contexts. Homelessness, joblessness, sexual issues, sexual identity issues, homosexuality, drug-related issues. You may find those in urban areas, but you'll certainly find them in small towns as well.
And traditionally, you don't also have the infrastructure in a rural context to help support the pastor in dealing with those.
Yeah.
You don't have the social services in place that can be an assistant. So you are on the front line with that. There are a number of questions coming in. Want to be able to take some of those. One question is, have any of you had to or choose to be bivocational in planting your church?
None here, none of the guys on the panel here, but I know of a couple of guys who have done small town church planting and have done it bivocationally.
Mm-hmm. And with the follow-up notes, I'll be sending a link. We did a webinar last January, a year ago. Al, you were part, and Hutch, I think you were part of it, but we had one or two of those guys were bivocational or co-vocational. Some of their jobs directly related to the church, some were lived in a parallel kind of fashion.
And I think some of the decision is, do you go in expecting to always be bivocational? And that is a way that you involve yourself in the community and meet folks in the community? Or do you go in saying, I'm going to do this until I'm able to get more funding? And that's a different way to view it. And I don't think there's a right or wrong, but you need to kind of reckon with those two options.
Yeah. I would say I haven't had to do that, thankfully, yet, but I was talking to my wife recently about this. I'm open to it, and I'm wondering if that might be a future part of my calling. But I will say, if that's something you're considering, do whatever you can to get a job in town, because then it can double as ministry and networking and meeting people. We had one guy who's part of our group cohort who's a fireman, and it gave him a great opportunity to be a part of the town. So it's definitely, North American Mission Board that has a lot of guys doing that, as far as I know.
I'll say that for us in the PCA world, bivocational feels like a unique thing, but it's not here. I would say probably the majority of pastors in Dunn are bivocational. Maybe not at the Methodist Church or the First Baptist, the kind of larger churches, but a lot of the smaller ones, a lot of the Free Will Baptist churches, some of the Pentecostal churches, that's the standard. And it's not, they're not thinking about it. It's literally ends meeting. It's not a matter of any kind of missional mindset. And so I think when we come into a rural situation like that, and Dunn's a poor place as well. Like we're very economically distressed on the whole. But if I had decided for bivocational, if I'd come in just talking about it from a missional standpoint, I think I would have missed a lot of the people wouldn't have known what I was talking about. Because for most pastors that are bivocational, it's not an option. It's a have to do it because they can't pay the bills. So
a question here about how you engage in evangelism discipleship. One of you had said, people are they're born under the steeple, but not part of the church. I mean, so there's that cultural Christianity connection there. What have you found that has been effective when it comes to evangelism and discipleship in a small town context?
I found that one of the challenges of being in a small town is that, this is an aspect of the Bible Belt, but most people are professing Christians. It is a strong cultural identity. If you were to tell someone, even if they're not practicing Christianity at all, that you don't think they're an unbeliever, it would be a deep insult. For them, it would be like calling them a Democrat, at least where I am. Yeah, can you imagine? So that's a challenge if people are assuming because they have walked an aisle or prayed a prayer, because their grandmother was a Christian, because they've had an experience in church, that they're a Christian. It's a challenge. It's almost like you have to deconstruct their false understanding of what Christianity is. And so that's pretty challenging. And, one of the things that I've found really helpful in my context was just doing the Evangelize Today residency with the doing faith interviews with people. So I found that so many of my relationships in town, I was doing a great job of building relationships, but finding it hard to move into gospel conversations because whenever I would, they would know a lot of the right answers. And there was an anxiety, it was almost a fear of someone telling them that they weren't a true Christian. It was almost like, a fear of, I'm not going to get the answers right. And so people didn't feel the freedom to be honest about what they truly believe, about their doubts, about all of those things. But in doing the faith interviews with Evangelize Today, how you begin the interview is by saying, I want to interview you about what you believe. I'm not going to tell you what I believe because my job is to see if I can listen to you and understand what you truly believe. And so it kind of changes the dynamic there. And I found that people that I knew that I kind of thought, man, they don't act like it, but they certainly, claim to be a Christian. All of a sudden, they started being honest. And I started finding out, man, these guys are like pantheists. I mean, they don't believe anything anywhere close to Christianity. But before, they were kind of signaling, I'm a Christian, more as a cultural identity, or more there's a fear that a religious person or a pastor is going to berate them or debate them, or they're going to have the right answers. So it created a safety to be able to talk about what they believed in a non-threatening kind of way. And that has been very fruitful for really getting into conversations about what they truly believe, where you can move from that into actually explaining what the gospel actually is.
And Tim, would you share about your bar experience, Tim?
Which bar experience? No, I'm kidding. I know what you're talking about now. So this bottle shop opened up in Dunn last summer, and I started just popping in. It's very interesting having grown up here because this was a dry county when I was a kid. And so this cool craft brewery bottle shop opens up. And so I have found that is by far the most fruitful place for me having any kind of spiritual conversation. And it can happen like that. I've gotten to know a number of the bartenders there and the owner. In fact, one afternoon, I went in there randomly. They were closed, but doing stock stuff, and just wound up hanging out with the owner for 4 or 5 hours. He's not a Christian, never been involved with any kind of church. And by the time the afternoon was over, we're weeping together, and he's asking, "Can I come to your church?" He hasn't yet, but we got to share. He was literally locked in a room with me for 4 hours, and I got to talk about Jesus. But what I've found is in there, I can have a deep conversation in 10, 15 minutes with someone. And I tell them I'm a pastor, but I don't come off as whatever. And all of a sudden they're telling me about their divorce last year, and asking me to pray for them. And I found that I've done a wide range of things since we've been back. I've coached soccer, which has been great, but it's hard. It's loving kids and families, but there's not opportunities to speak with people. I've hung out at the local coffee shop, but man, that takes a year to even have a deep conversation with the barista. But at the bar, happens in 15 minutes. And so I've become de facto kind of like parish pastor to these folks. They haven't come to my church yet, but they know who we are. They know who I am. And yeah, that's been the unexpected surprise on my end, as far as being able to have very deep, very personal conversations right away. Yeah.
And I think,
next week, I was going to say next week, we're going to be, we've got Alan Dayhoff with Evangelize Today, and a number of the guys are doing this very thing. So if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to tune into that, because it's kind of be helping in that same way. But that's great. Yeah, Corey, you were going to say?
Well, I'm just saying that, small towns also have disenfranchised people, that there are places you can go that, because it's a small town, if you've done something wrong, the shame and the guilt may kick you out of the religious places and the family graces. And same, Tim, I went to a bar yesterday. All day long I was like, Lord, where do I need to go to reach people outside of the normal places? And I sat down at a bar and had a conversation with the guy next to me and the bartender. Both had been divorced, remarried. The bartender was married to a former pastor for 2 years. I said, I want to hear the rest of that story. I had to go. And she was like, I want to tell you the rest of that story. It's just, a complete openness in those settings where people are hurting and want to talk. And like Hutch was saying about the Evangelize Today, being able to listen. I know that Al Dayhoff preaches continually is, listening to hear, not listening to speak. And that's part of that, going back to that building trust with people. Eventually I want to start Bible studies. It's going to take a long time. I want to be able to have, ask questions and listen to what's going on in the community before I ever say, hey, would you be involved in a Bible study?
As far as evangelism, discipleship, when you're trying to meet people, we really have to un-PCA ourselves. And so if I can try to explain what I mean.
Please do, because we could all get in trouble.
So there's a very specific cultural PCA-ness to us. And so I would say, like Tim Keller talks about Christianese, we also have Reformed-ese and Gospel-ese. And we have to try to remember that when we go into specific context, there's words we use in some contexts that we don't use in others because it's foreign language. And so one of the things I get often asked is, what denomination are you a part of? Because it's not right there in our name. And I will not answer that right away, because if you're not, if you grew up Baptist or Lutheran or Methodist, you're not going to walk into a Presbyterian church. you're going to shut down right as soon as you hear that word. So usually I'll answer that question by saying, giving a little snapshot of who we are as a denomination. I'll say, well, our denomination started in 1973. We came out of a denomination that had started to veer away from scripture. And we started with 3 core values: that we believe the Bible, we believe in the grace of God, and we believe in telling people about Jesus. And that summarizes faithful to scriptures, true to the Reformed faith, and obedient to the Great Commission. But it's taken those phrases and putting them in a language that, I say that to a Baptist guy. Oh yeah, well, I believe that too, so remembering like where we are and how we can talk, it's code switching. If you've ever heard that term, we have to code switch too when we're going to certain places.
Yeah, oh, great. I'm going to pick up some of these other questions. One from Jonathan Cully is asking about, have any of you worked with non-white pastoral interns or planters in these cohorts or rural networks? If so, what are some of the challenges or breakthroughs? So I know, Kent, you had mentioned it, and Tim as well, a very diverse context, but one fraught with a lot of pain and hurt. Any thoughts there? How have you been able to bridge that gap or bring other voices in?
It's been so before we moved back to Dunn, we were in Orlando, and while in Orlando, I did my internship at Christ United Fellowship with Mike Aitchison. And part of my heartbeat going down and coming back is to see the diversity of God's kingdom reflected here, and the diversity of our town. But it's not reflected in any church here. And so that's been something that my family and our church has been intentional about. We've seen some fruit there with non-white families. We are still majority white. And Dunn is a very segregated place, incredibly segregated. Most of the business owners, most of the landowners are still old white guys. And it's been a long road to get to anything that wasn't just kind of just white dominant on every level of decision maker. And so it's something that we have been intentional about with the things we've decided to do outreach wise. And we are praying. I pray every day that God continues to diversify us, especially racially. We have generational diversity, economic diversity in our church, but further see that, because I think there are so many trying to think of the best ways to say it. That's part of the longing in my heart. We haven't seen it come to bear here in Dunn as far as leadership development or future interns, but it's absolutely something we want to see.
For us, we're in a 50-50 African-American and white context. And so it's been really helpful just to build relationships first off, because you have to earn trust, build relationships, meet people where they are. So what's been helpful for me is getting into the schools. I'm a drummer. I taught drums for elementary kids here. And so that was mostly African-American kids. So I got to meet some families through that. Being a part of the football team, it's very diverse, but that's an opportunity to meet people and make friends. The head coach, who is African-American, became one of my best friends in town. And so just building those relationships. And it was through being a part of the school system that I got to know Shanez Paget, who is now our worship director. I met him as a 15-year-old, and over 3 years, just kind of talked with him every once in a while. And then when a position came up, I went to him and I said, hey, are you interested in this mission and vision? We hired him as a 19-year-old, and he is just doing an amazing job. And so we're doing, cross-cultural worship on Sundays. We have seen a little bit of diversity take root because of that. We want to see a whole lot more, but we meet weekly. I'm going to be meeting with him again tonight, and we're doing what we're calling a seminary prep class, just to get him used to the idea of reading and showing up on time for meetings. And not that he doesn't do that, but showing up to class and meeting with me and going over readings, and I'm going to have him turn in some papers at the end of it. And so he's very interested in the LAMP program. So that's what we're talking through right now. But it's been I tell you what, I've learned probably more than he's learned from me. Just working with him, it's been amazing. The other thing is, Corey mentioned this, is where are you going to hang out? A lot of guys, again, in the PCA love going to the craft beer places, love going to the fancy coffee shops and all that. And that's great, but you're only going to meet certain people there. You're going to meet a different variety of people if you go to Burger King and Taco Bell and McDonald's. And so that's where I usually spent my time drinking diet soda and studying the Bible and getting ready for a sermon, was at those places. And I got to meet a lot of people through that as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. You bring it up a little bit there, Kent. Question here from Dean Faulkner. Interested in knowing how some of you guys apprentice and train guys or have thought about it since they're at RTS looking and training church planters. Any thoughts there? I know some of your presbyteries have used LAMP or Third Mill. Obviously have the opportunity for RTS there. Charlotte, you've got the proximity.
Really, we're really just getting started out with Shenez 101 and this opportunity I just picked out 5 books, and we're going to do that over the spring. We're going to read together and study together, and I'm going to have him write some reports at the end. But he's looking at possibly starting LAMP either in the summer or in the fall. So I want to kind of get him used to the idea of reading and turning in stuff and being on schedule.
Yeah. And he's from that town. He's from that area.
Yeah, he's from the community, has a great network of friends and ability to, invite people and meet with people and all that. So, and we don't have enough time for me to just brag on him, but he is just an incredibly talented young man. I mean, he's 20 years old, entrepreneur, started a business, has staff people under him, works for us part-time, just incredible savant type guy.
No,
so I would say that idea is crucial in that it's not very sexy to go to a small town to plant. So more and more, we're going to have to raise up our small town planters from within. Kent's got to raise up a guy to plant the next plant out of his church in the next neighboring town. Tim the same, Hutch the same. Because when I talk to potential planters who are coming out of our assessment and I say, you want to go plant in a small town, I hear crickets, So even though I think the joys are there and it's a wonderful place of ministry, parish ministry is really strong, great benefits, but we're going to more and more have to raise up guys from within.
Yeah, I absolutely. I have the best call in the world, but I know that people weren't. My presbytery did a church planting plan with all the fastest growing things done, was 25 on the list when I came knocking on the door. So I had to beat that drum until the drum head came off and then replace it and beat it some more. But yeah, and the other piece of that, Alan, is that there's no offense to folks from Ohio. I could not send somebody from Ohio to the next town over, to Clinton, North Carolina. It would take them 15 years to gain the relational capital to not be an outsider that the folks there are expecting to leave at any moment. And so it's going to have to be, if we're serious about planting rural churches, we're going to have to raise up from within. We're going to have to home grow our leadership.
So
and also like this conversation, this webinar, I know Hutch hosted a rural church event at RTS. We're going to do something at General Assembly this year. So talking about it more, I just think, a lot of times it's just not on guys' radar to minister in rural places. And the more we can get it on their radar and talk about these joys of being in a small place and the hardships that and hitting both from within and from without.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of what we're glad to see here happening in Wisconsin. So many of the guys who are in our program doing hybrid seminary through some with LAMP, with RTS, with Covenant, they're ideal for the small towns. They're from there. And most of us who have gone through a residential seminary program it's not on our radar. And even if it was, we're not from there. And it's like Walmart coming in and it's not going to help the downtown business type of picture. So yeah, so part of that discipleship of raising them up, you're looking to raise up not just good elders, officers, you're looking up to raise up the future pastors and planters who are from that town.
And another thing we might have to do, I mentioned this before we got on the call, is I went to RTS Orlando 13 to 16. I went through assessment and all the M&A training, worked for Steve Childers. I had multiple people trying to talk me out of coming home because I could go to XYZ place and make a bigger impact. So we've got to change our mindset of the way we talk about what church planting is and what impact is, because I mean, honestly, it was a little bit sexy at the idea of going to this town that has great Thai restaurants. Dunn does not have a Thai place. It killed me. But, you know, I don't know that it feels like a viable option when guys are in the midst of training if they've left their local area.
Yeah. We are almost out of time. And if I understand from my experience in a rural context, conversations and relationships are more important than time. And I'm going to violate everything from my suburban and German background. And so if you guys need to leave right at the top of the hour, if not, we got a lot more questions. I want to be able to answer these. You don't know how uncomfortable I feel right now doing this, but just hang in there with me.
Welcome to town.
Yeah. Was there anyone want to pick up on that before we hit the top of the hour?
I was going to say on that same conversation, it really is a neat opportunity. You're gonna be able to do things in a small town that you just won't get away with, like being a football chaplain for the high school. There's certain things that a small town is going to be more receptive to. People really do respect pastors. But for me, me personally, I mentioned this before we went live, but I did not go through the Atlanta church plant assessment. I had kind of a specified assessment done here in our local presbytery because I honestly don't know if I would have passed church plant assessment in ATL. I really don't know. But I will say if there's anybody out there that's like, yeah, I just don't see myself as the church plant guy. I don't know if I've got the personality, but I really want to see the gospel come to people and I want to see people converted and saved. And, this might be the thing for you. It takes a certain personality, a certain attitude to be able to be a small town church planter. And some people won't trust the big gregarious entrepreneur type church planter moving into their town and trying to take over. They need somebody that's a little more low key, a little more slow, a little more trustworthy. So yeah, I would say maybe that's you out there, whoever's listening.
Right. I think it's a great thing. Rethinking how we assess for people in different contexts, I think is really critical. Yeah. There's a question here is about the speed with which you established worship. You're in a context in which people do not have easy access. You can't just kind of hang out at a church 15 minutes away that has good word and sacraments, ordinary means of grace. So the question is, did you feel the need to move quicker towards that? And is that an impediment? Normally we think, well, you've got to have 75 people in a worship service before you start meeting on a regular basis. That's again a different model than what I would imagine you're finding in your context. What are your thoughts there?
Tim, talk about that. I said you've had your experience on that. Talk about that question.
Yeah, so I had made my prospectus and I was going to work through it, and we were gearing up for launching public worship, had our ministry teams and all that stuff ready, and we got shut down. Our first preview service was going to be the week of COVID shutdowns, March 2020. And so we had to pivot pretty quickly. And we wound up launching worship that fall in my front yard. And it felt like a cult. It felt weird. I went and asked all my neighbors, can I set up a sound system? Is that okay? Yes. But we worshiped outside through the winter and just braved the weather, and it was great. Moved into a beautiful downtown space last Easter, and it's been wonderful. But to the point of the question specifically, yeah, I had been a part, like I said earlier, of a church plant in Orlando, and there are plenty of great PCA churches in Orlando. And so our launch team that we were we were pulling folks who are already in really great churches. And we get here, and the folks that we had that were in churches, they weren't great. They weren't places where their souls were being fed by the gospel. There weren't places where they were being nourished. And so there was definitely a sense of a need to begin public worship together. And so we launched before, launching outside was not on the docket. We had to throw the prospectus out and everything, but yeah, and it was a great idea. We've seen ourselves become a means of grace church without even really meaning to necessarily in the midst of COVID. But it's been wonderful. We do Lord's Supper every week. I think a lot of churches around here would come in and think we were a little high church, but we're not. Like I dress casually. Everybody else does for the most part as well. But we do Lord's Supper every week. We have a pretty standard Reformed order of worship, and people eat it up. They come in and they love these pieces. Yeah, so I think our approach here was absolutely different than if we had been somewhere where I felt like the people we were gathering were in places where they were hearing the word and receiving the means of grace in that way. Because, I don't want people to I don't want to tell people, for this meantime, you need to drive 45 minutes. Like that doesn't work. So.
Any thoughts on engaging your presbytery? Now, Corey, that's kind of part of your role is to help make that bridge, I would assume, with TVP and such. But, I see kind of a movement, presbyteries forming more in an urban context. So more and more presbytery forming around a city, which then cuts off the, city and the suburbs. But once you get rural, they don't have quite the infrastructure then to deal with that. So any thoughts how to encourage a presbytery to be more engaging in thinking rural planting?
Well, I think Tennessee Valley Presbytery actually was moving forward. I know they were moving forward before I got there because that's how I'm there now. Yeah. They were already thinking, okay, we've planted in Chattanooga, we've planted in Knoxville, and everywhere in between there pretty much is small town and rural. So where do we go next? And I can't remember what it is, 20 churches by sometime, and they're on mark to do that. I mean, they're aggressive about planting churches, and so that presbytery is already doing it. Now they actually hired an outside group to help them raise funds, particularly for church planting, which has been tremendously helpful to them. But being able to talk to presbyteries about that, the presbytery that was going to call me initially said, "We don't have the funds. You need to go to Tennessee Valley and start talking to them," and that's been very beneficial.
And I'll just add, we just had to kind of face reality that a lot of the churches in our presbytery kind of had this idea that, maybe we're at a place of saturation. Do we really need more churches? And then whenever you just break out the presbytery map and you start taking a look at reality, for us, the reality is in Tennessee Valley, we have 31 counties. That's primarily in East Tennessee. It's 5 in Georgia. 17 of those have no PCA church, which I'm not great at math, but I think that's the majority. So we had this idea that, we're just killing it. We just got churches everywhere. The reality was we are surrounded by frontier, and here's the problem. We haven't even noticed it. It's not even on our radar. Forgotten places. You drive through these towns, you see these little steeples everywhere, but the reality is they're often gospel deserts. But we've not slowed down and paid attention. And so we had to get that reality before our Presbyterian and say, guys, we are not fulfilling the Great Commission. This area has been entrusted to us. And the majority of our counties, we're not even identifying. And so that began to get some traction. We began to say, it began to shift from this idea that, oh, we're just killing it. We got churches everywhere. The reality is we don't at all. There's just frontier all around us. There's unreached people all around us. We got to start thinking lost rather than just have we given a reformed option to all the people that want it.
I would say what's helped our presbytery is two main things. One is Kevin Thumpston. Most of you guys know him. He kind of champions the rural, small town planting, but also just revitalization for our presbytery. The other thing is, depending on your presbytery, it might not work out, but a lot of people assume presbytery is going to be at some of the biggest churches that have means and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things our presbytery has started doing is going to these smaller, kind of more rural, small town churches. And so just 1 year in, we were actually able to host presbytery in the building that we had. We still only had 20 people coming regularly for worship. So it was a bit of a, logistical task for us to host, but it was great for people that had heard about this because it actually was through the presbytery that this building got donated. And a lot of these guys hadn't been to the church. So it was neat for them to just show up and see the building that had been donated. And we were actually in the middle of some renovations in the sanctuary. So they got to see firsthand, we didn't clean everything up for them. We wanted them to see what we were doing. And so that was neat too. Just as much as your presbyteries are able to, go to these churches that maybe wouldn't be on your radar to host presbytery. Just go talk to the pastor, see where they are, and be, open your eyes to what God's doing in these places.
Yeah, I'm in Eastern Carolina Presbytery, best presbytery in the PCA. I love it. But when I came back, like I said, Dunn was not on the radar. But when I started beating that drum, there was huge buy-in. And what I discovered in my conversations was that our presbytery is majority Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill, Triangle area. We have a few churches kind of scattered throughout Eastern Carolina, but we have a lot of towns like Dunn that don't have any PCA presence. And there was a desire to see a plant happen somewhere, but they didn't really know how to do that. And I discovered as I met folks, the vast majority of our TEs are not from North Carolina. They're from somewhere else, and they've got a call in North Carolina, and they're doing phenomenal work, and God's put them there. But there was just I don't know how to break into Dunn. I don't know how to break into this place. And so we came back, and I was beating that drum, and they said, I've had it said to me, you're going to be the guinea pig to see if this can work. But to the credit of the churches in our presbytery, they have just rolled the red carpet out in helping us, friendship support, resource support. Our two biggest financial supporters church-wise are a city center church and a suburban church. And that's just a testament. We are not on their radar. They don't have anybody driving from Dunn to their church, but they see the need, and they had the resources, and so they got behind it. So I think it's going to take, coming back to what we talked about, taking seriously a leadership from within the presbytery, leadership development, to branch out into more rural planting.
Yeah, no, that's great. Good. Well, thanks so much, guys. Appreciate your time, and really, this is a great conversation. They're just beginning to scratch the surface for a lot more thought about how we can be effective in reaching such an unreached area of our country. Appreciate your time. We'll be back next week, as I said, with Evangelize Today. We'll be talking about with a number of guys that are doing some of the things that Kent and Tim and Hutch we're talking about, and Corey talking about, meeting people where they're at, and that is a really great opportunity. And then be about a month in March, talking with Dean Faulkner and the church planning program at RTS. So be looking for that. And when I send out the information, there'll be a lot of links to a variety of books we didn't get to mention, and other information if you want to follow up with any of that. And so until the next time, Lord bless. Take care.